Delegation. We apologize for the bit of a late start. We've had a couple of technical difficulties this afternoon, so thank you for bearing with us. My name is Sonalyn Wrigley, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Integral Healthcare Solutions. And I have with me today Thomas Goddard and Lesley Malice Reed, and we are delighted to be talking to you about delegation from a URAC perspective. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Sana. My name is Tom Goddard. Again, I'll echo Sana's apology. We had like about 5 different technical difficulties happening all at once, but we're glad to be with you now, and really are grateful that you joined us for this episode of our monthly webinars. I'm the founder and CEO of Integral Healthcare Solutions, and very briefly, former Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel of URAC, former Vice President and General Counsel of Malcare Health Plans in the Mid-Atlantic, and a few other things over the years. But we've been, Integral Healthcare Solutions has been operating for about 16 and a half years. And I lured Lesley, who will introduce herself now, to join me about a year in. Yeah, I started this in 2002, and Lesley joined me in 2003. Lesley, tell us who you are.
Hi, this is Lesley Malice Reed, and I am President of Integral Healthcare Solutions. I see a lot of people on the side here chatting and asking if there is a call-in number. I'm hoping that everybody can hear us well. There is no call-in number. We just chat on the side, and we will be talking in a forum, in a panel forum such as this, through the calls, and we ask that you add some questions in the chat area that we could answer for you. Just going back, I was a reviewer at URAC way back when, in the 90s, and worked there for several years, made it to director of a few of the programs. And as Tom said, I joined him at Integral Healthcare Solutions in 2003. And we've been doing this ever since and are very excited to lend our experience on some of the standards that we wrote a long time ago about delegation that we've been trying to clarify since the 90s. And we hope today to give you some clarification. So, Tom, if you wouldn't mind, I really feel like you are the grandfather, if you will, of the old Core 3.0. I don't even know what version it was back when we started, maybe in the 2.0s, of the original delegation standard. And if you could give a little brief description of what the issue is and why it causes so many people trouble.
Well, one of the issues is, what is delegation? And URAC has always had, ever since Core 1.0, a very specific definition of delegation that is not necessarily the universal definition of delegation. For example, in the Medicare world, there's a very different definition of it. So I'm not going to read URAC's definition. I encourage you all to look in the glossary and look at that. I'm going to talk to you about it, how I have come to think about it, which helps me sort through some of the confusion. So let's start with a delegate or a delegated contractor. I'll use those terms interchangeably. Is an organization, individual that you hire, your organization hires to do something.
Oh, I think the Tom.
To do something that URAC either requires you to do or tells you how to do, and it has to be in the non-core part of your standards. In other words, if you're a specialty pharmacy, it's in the specialty pharmacy part of the standards. If you're a health plan, it's in the health plan part of the standards. So I'll repeat that. It's an organization, not an individual, that you've hired to do something that URAC cares about, either by requiring you to do it within the scope of your accreditation or telling you how to do it within the scope of your accreditation. And it's the business that you're in, whether that's specialty pharmacy or health plan or utilization management or case management. So now what does that leave out? So in other words, what is not a delegate or a delegated contractor? Well, first of all, if you hire an individual to do this, so are the doctors that you hire as peer reviewers, delegated contractors. No, they may be contractors, and you may think you're delegating something to them, but because they're individuals, they're not covered by URAC's definition. What if you hire a shredding company to shred your documents? Well, that too is outside the scope of delegated contractor. It's dealt with in the URAC standards, but not under the delegation standards. Because the shredding company really isn't doing anything that you're in the business of. You're not in the business of shredding documents. However, URAC cares about shredding as PHI, particularly for vendors that touch PHI, like shredding companies or offsite document storage companies. They're touching PHI or IIHI, consumer health information. So URAC cares about it, and over in the current standards, other than Core 4.0, URAC tells you in Core 16 that you need to be careful and the kinds of things that you need to do in order to be careful with consumer health information. But that's not the business you're in, so that's also outside the scope.
So just to summarize, if I am an organization, not an individual, so I'm an IRO, and I am going to delegate to a provider network a bunch of the standards, they're individuals, they're not an organization. Are they a vendor? Are they a delegate? How does that work?
Well, I mean, you raise an interesting point. I mean, the members of the network are individuals, but if they are contracted, you said with a health network, if there's a company that you turn your peer review over to, and they hire individuals, you're contracting with an organization. So that's within the scope of the URAC definition. So if I'm a more common way to, another way to think about it, just to look at that same issue from a slightly different place on the playing field. If you're a health plan and you hire an IRO to handle your appeals, that IRO may have individual contracts with providers. And so ultimately that's an individual out there doing this work for you, but you're contracted with the independent review organization. You, the health plan, are contracted with the IRO to do these. And so that is a delegation situation. In fact, that's one of the most common delegation situations that we see, where a health plan or a utilization management organization contracts with an IRO to handle peer reviews. And that is within the scope of the delegation.
But if I were to contract with a medical director as a part-time, not an employee, is that medical director a delegate, a contract employee? How would that work?
That is simply a contractor. So that is not a URAC delegation situation, because you've contracted with an individual to serve as your medical director.
If I contract as a health plan with a network of let's see, a vision plan, would that be a vendor? Is it within scope of accreditation, or is it outside of scope of the accreditation? And I'm sorry, I'm peppering you with very tough questions, but these come up over the years.
Well, no, these are. I mean, that's perfect. That's a perfect situation. So we got a health plan contracting with, and let's not take the special case of vision, because that has some other questions involved. But let's just take it's a PPO. Health plan contracts with a PPO to cover a certain part of their area that their own network doesn't cover. You've raised a real interesting issue that goes all the way back to when you and I were both reviewers at URAC 20 years ago. In fact, I kind of caused a little scandal, because I said, as a reviewer, I said, well, yes. And you know, kind of the whole URAC network world said, no, we don't mean that, because here's where URAC ended up on that. It depends on what the network is doing for you is with providers. Now, contracting with providers is the subject of quite a number.
You froze.
You
need to repeat what you just said. Okay.
Okay. So let's go back.
Tom is located in Arizona, that is having wild thunderstorms, which is why we're having so many difficulties today.
It's a crazy October rainstorm going on with lightning and wind and craziness. But I hope I'm all right now. So your question, Lesley, provokes kind of that world of questions around: is a network that is to which a let's say health plan delegates a part of its network a delegated contractor? And the answer is, depends on what they're doing for you. If the network, let's say it's a PPO, is only contracting with the providers in the network, that's all they're doing, you might think, as I did 20 years ago, that that's a delegation. And because URAC cares about how you contract with your providers, there are 7 or 8 standards dealing with delegation, or dealing with contracting with providers in a network situation. But URAC, many years ago, or probably in the early aughts, carved out an exception to delegated to delegation, and says we're not talking about contracting. Now, that doesn't mean that this PPO to which you've delegated these functions is not a delegated contractor if, and this is where we toss it into your realm, Lesley, if that network is also credentialing the providers. That is squarely within the world of credentialing and the world of delegation. That's within URAC's definition of delegation. So, and then that triggers, and I'll toss this back to you. So ask me so many, you're not the only one who gets to ask questions. What are the, when you do delegate credentialing, there's some additional requirements that kick in, right, in those scary credentialing standards that I've avoided for 20 years. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Oversight requirements for credentialing delegation. I know we're going to talk about oversight, but let's jump in right now. The oversight is that, so first the oversight is threefold. One is that you are expected to do a preview of anyone you're going to credential. And you're going to delegate credentialing to. So you go on site, you do a review. You could just do a file review. You don't have to go on site. I like to go on site personally. I like to see how things are organized. I like to see confidentiality the first time. And you'll make sure that they're meeting the URAC standards. And then you'll bring them forth to your credentialing committee for their approval. The next oversight is that every few years you need to do a file review. And that file review is going to be of 10% of the files, no more than 10, no less than 30, okay? So you want to do a review of files. It could be a mix of files. You're going to come up with what score folks have to meet. And then again, you're going to bring that review of them to your credentialing committee. If they don't pass, you've already accepted them and it's their re-review years later, 2 years later, and they don't pass, you're going to put them in a corrective action plan. But again, you have to bring that corrective action plan and the results of it back to the committee for their review. The third aspect of oversight is anytime you're going to add providers to your network and your delegate sends you, let's say, 6 new providers this month, it's your responsibility to take a look at those 6 providers against the history of anyone you may have denied or terminated in the past so that they can't sneak in as a delegate. You want to be able to say, we'll take these 5, but not this one. So you're going to do that. Then you're going to bring them again to your credentialing committee for their review, because they may know something and ask you to review a little more in depth one of the providers. And they get to approve those providers. So those are the 3 aspects of oversight that have to happen. In addition, there is a requirement that's a quality management type of review as decided by you. Maybe you want to know how many providers have been re-credentialed. Are there any issues that you're having in quality? And of course, your core standards under Core 3.0 require you to do an annual review of policies and procedures. Now, all of this oversight goes away, all of it, if you actually contract with a URAC accredited organization. So if you're using a CVO, Credential Verification Organization, or you are in a contract with a URAC approved health planner network, then all you need to have is a URAC delegation compliant contract. You do not need to have any of this oversight.
So thank you, Lesley. Lesley was focusing on credentialing at my invitation, and let me broaden it out. So the credentialing vetting process and the credentialing oversight process is the most rigorous across all of the URAC accreditation programs. It has its own special standard, CR17, either PCR17 or NCR17, depending on whether you're looking at the delegation, the health plan standards or the network standards. The general standards for delegation don't, for example, require the file review. So let's back up and generalize a bit about if you're not delegating to a credentialing program, what are the requirements? And we are now in a period in URAC's history where we have to talk about two standards at the same time. Some of you represent companies that are currently under either Core 3.0 or Farm Core 3.1. And others of you, if you've started your reaccreditation process, are already looking at the new delegation standards that we find both in Core 4.0 and 3.2. 3.2 was rolled out in August 1st. Little history here. Let me give you a little core history so this makes some sense. URAC in February rolled out core version 4.0, but only rolled it out for case management and a shrunken version of it for certificate of organizational management and community pharmacy. So only those three programs have core 4.0. URAC's going to spend the next year kind of looking at how the new core standards do with those limited groups of organizations, and then at some point, I'm guessing next year, but maybe even later, we'll roll out, well, maybe make some tweaks and then roll out a perfected version of it. However, URAC took just the new delegation standard and reconfigured it and stuck it into the existing core, either Farm Core 3.1 or Core 3.0, and replaced those delegation standards with a single delegation standard. So under Core 3.0, those of you who haven't started your reaccreditation program, you know delegation as Core 6, 7, 8, and 9. The new version, I believe, is now Core 9. They've taken all four of those and shrunk them into Core 9, and they've kept 6, 7, and 8 as placeholders. You're probably familiar when URAC likes to preserve numbering. So 6, 7, and 8 are now empty for those for Core 3.2 and Core 4.0. So I'll speak out of both sides of my mouth to give you a sense of where we've been and where we're going. So as Lesley said, first there are standards that require under the current standards that you have a process for vetting your delegated contractors before you hire them. Now, these standards don't apply to your existing relationships for first-time applicants. They are simply for new delegated contractors. I've never quite understood why we have two standards for this. Basically, I think of them together. Core 6 says you've got to have criteria for your delegated contractor. And then you have to have a process that you go through that looks at those criteria to help you assess whether a prospective delegated contractor meets those criteria. That's 6 and 7. That's the vetting process. As Lesley said, that doesn't apply if you're hiring a URAC accredited vendor for that's accredited in the services that you're hiring them for. And then as you heard from Lesley, CR17 adds some detail to that process. But for non-credentialing delegated contractors, it's really just that. I've got criteria, and then I use them and the process that I describe in my policies and procedures to make sure that this delegate is going to be able to appropriately do what I need them to do.
Essentially what I'm looking for when I'm looking to see if you have a pre-delegation assessment is just that you've reviewed their policy and procedures against your own policies and procedures and against the URAC standards or whatever accreditation you're trying to meet.
Got it. Now, so that's core 6 and 7. Core 8 in version of core 3.0 or farm core 3.1. Core 8 is the contracting requirement. This one doesn't go away if you contract with a URAC accredited company. So they are, you are required to meet 8 requirements, A through H, in your contract with your delegate. There are 2 mandatory elements in this standard, and they both have to do with URAC. The first is B, which says that your your delegate needs to agree in this contract to perform those functions that you're delegating to it in accordance with your policies and URAC standards. Now, the contract doesn't necessarily need to say URAC. If your policies and procedures quite clearly communicate to the vendor that URAC is in there and they meet URAC standards, then you're in good shape. But I've always thought because there has been some variance in the in interpretations over the years by URAC and URAC reviewers, I just think it's safer if you can possibly do it to use the name URAC in there just to make it clear. It's also kind of good delegate relations. I mean, make it clear to your delegates that you have an expectation that they do things in accord with URAC standards. Just to put a bookmark in here, the new delegation standard makes it real clear that you are in charge. You, the delegating entity, are in charge of ensuring that the delegated contractor does comply with URAC standards that apply to those functions. So it goes at it a different way.
A cautionary tale about core 3.0, 3.1. In my years of experience, now I want to back up for a minute and just remind those of you who are experienced in health plan and health network standards. There's a standard called NM10. And in NM10, it says, listen, if you don't have everything in all of your contracts, we're not going to make you amend all 150, 200 plus contracts. We're going to say that as long as your provider manual has these aspects of the contract in it, you're okay. Now, the delegation of core 8, that's not true. It is not a forgiving standard. If you don't have in all of your service agreements with your delegates, all of the A through, did you say H elements? All of the A through H elements, you will be out of compliance, which means when you're getting ready to go, especially for you newbies going for initial accreditation, you want some time to recontract or amend your contracts to ensure that these aspects are in your contracts before URAC shows up. So you can submit a compliant template for your desktop application, but then they have to be implemented if you're under core 3.0 or 3.1. Tom, I'm not familiar with 3.2. Is that a true statement for 3.2? Because in our experience, we know 2 companies who could not get full accreditation because they didn't get all of the contracts back. And they got, there was a poll, it's a random poll of delegates, and those were the contracts that were pulled, and they weren't yet compliant or amended. So is that true as well for 3.2/4.0?
It is not. And that's because 8 vanished. Now, you don't have an 8-point standard anymore in 3.2 and 4.0 that lists this must be here, and you don't have any mandatory elements that say, you've got to have your delegate sign a contract that has this language in it. You do have to have a contract, but it's not as specific. The standard is not as specific as 8. So it really does only apply to those of you who are still under 3.0 or Farm Core 3.1.
So getting back to what we were talking about, we said 6 requires a vetting, and then as does 7 says you need to have a contract. 8 talks about the actual what's included in the contract. Now 9 is the oversight. We went into it in depth detail for credentialing. What other folks need to know about the oversight?
Under 3.0 and 3.1, the oversight is 3 parts. As Lesley said when she was describing the credentialing process, an annual review of policies and procedures, just to make sure that their policies and procedures still meet your requirements. The second is to have an ongoing assessment of compliance with the contract and with your policies and procedures. And the third element is an evaluation of financial incentives. And this has been variously interpreted over the last 15 or so years. You know, is it your financial incentives with them? Is it any financial incentives that they have internally? We've always thought it was safer to interpret it most broadly. And so, for example, if your delegated contractor doesn't have financial incentives with their employees, to get an attestation from them is a good practice, saying that, you know, we don't have financial incentives that relate to consumer utilization of healthcare. But anyway, those are the 3 specific elements. Now, let's now take a quick look at the new standard, 3.2, in Core 3.2 and 4.0. There's one standard, and it basically says you are responsible for everything you delegate, and you have a mechanism to hold your delegated contractors accountable. And that's it. I strongly encourage you to go deeply into the interpretive information that URAC provides. You know, some standards are so self-evident that you can kind of know what you need to do from the standard itself. That is not true of the new delegation standard. You really need to get to know what URAC says in the interpretive guide. So don't skip that step. Or if you're working with us, go to our tips and tricks where we provide some additional information about that. And you can find that on our website too. Just go to the tips page.
Oh, Tom, you've frozen once again.
About how to do a document submission for a particular standard. Sorry, you froze for the
last 30 seconds.
Oh my goodness. So I was just saying, I'm strongly encouraging you to use the interpretive guide for this standard, the new Core 9 in version 3.2, and I forget the number in the, it's the last standard in the new core standards. I forget the number. It always takes me about a year or 2 to learn all the numbers of a brand new set of standards, and I haven't quite learned the new ones, but I know it's the last one. So read the interpretive guide. It's going to be more useful than you can imagine. But it's basically very, very general. You are responsible, and you need a whole program of mechanisms to make sure that your delegate is in fact complying with the URAC standards, has a continuing ability to perform the functions that they're performing. All of that was overtly stated in the old standards, and now it's implied by the you're in charge of making sure that they meet URAC requirements when they do. So you talked about the fact that under Core 3.1, 3.0, there are standards Core 6 through 9. And then in 4.0, 3.2, there is just one standard. So would you say that the standards are just written more clearly? Is it a little bit easier standard to meet? What is your take on it? It's interesting. I've been trying to figure that out since we first saw this standard in its early forms last year. It looked at first, because there was no Core 8, like it might be a lower bar. But the more I study it and talk to people, and both inside URAC and outside URAC, the more I realize it's probably more flexible, but in some ways it might even ask more responsibility from the delegating organization. I think we'll have to sort out and see. Obviously they're so new, August 1st, we haven't seen any results from RFIs or on-site reviews or off-site validation reviews to see exactly how that shapes up. I have a feeling ultimately we'll probably call it a wash. And it's, and we'll find that we have to pay more attention in some areas, and we'll have more flexibility in other areas. I think that's probably what it is. It's at least as rigorous, but
Let's
it's more
talk a little
flexible.
bit about when the on-site happens. So for desktop review, you're just going to submit a template contract that shows you can meet everything and have a policy and procedure that talks about your protocol. But what happens during the on-site? What can they expect?
During the validation review, whether it's on-site or virtual, you'll need a comprehensive list of the delegated entities. Now, two things to note. Make sure it's comprehensive as to URAC's definition. So don't leave anyone out, because if you leave it off the list and then the reviewer comes across a delegated contractor that wasn't on the list, that'll raise some concerns in the reviewer's mind. On the other hand, don't include your shredding company, your offsite document storage, your language line, all of these other organizations that are dealt with over in the privacy and confidentiality kind of core 4, core 16 world. So you give them a comprehensive list of these delegated contractors, and the reviewer will select a sampling of that. And reviewers vary in terms of how many, they're probably not supposed to, but they do vary in terms of how many they select from that. I think a dozen is a pretty common number to select if you have a lot of them. If you have only 8, they'll select all of them. I mean, I would look at every delegated contractor if you have fewer than 10. And that's how they'll review your the contracts. And then remember, for those that aren't URAC accredited, you'll also need to show documentation of all of the elements of oversight, whatever that is, under Core 3.0 and Farm Core 3.1. What that is the documentation of the annual review of policies and procedures, documentation that you have been monitoring the delegate's performance against the requirements of the contract, and that you have oversight of any financial incentives that may be going on there. We have lost Lesley. There she goes. So remember that if you have any delegated contractors that on that list that are not URAC accredited, you've got those core 9 requirements to meet, and you've got a document. Remember, URAC says the underlying URAC philosophy is that if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Now, a further subset is some of those may be credentialing folk, and then you've got the URAC reviewer will look at documentation of that to meet the requirements of CR 17.
Talk to that for a minute. They're going to want to see, in addition to the contract, they're going to want to see oversight. They're going to want to see communications of those added providers, and then they're going to look at your credentialing minutes to see when they were discussed. Was there a file review? Was there a review for the vetting, and of course for the added providers? In addition, they may ask specifically, I'd like to see so-and-so delegate, just to see what happened when you did the file review. Okay. We do have a...
Yeah, let me, you reminded me of one thing, Lesley, that I left out. If it's a not accredited delegate, then they'll also, and it's new. It's new since your last accreditation if you're going through for reaccreditation. If you hired a new delegate in that process, they'll want to see that you that you had criteria and that you assessed your prospective delegate before you hired them against those criteria. So make sure you have good documentation of that process. That is a rare thing because it applies only to it only comes up during reaccreditation. It's out of scope if you're a first-time applicant and you hired a delegate before you submitted your documents for desktop review. So it's out of scope for that. So it's only reaccreditation or very, very recent. It is, organization is not URAC accredited. So you don't see it very often, but if they do see it, they'll want to see your vetting process.
One of the stumbling blocks, there's actually two in credentialing that I would just like to touch upon. The first one is that the number of files reviewed for NCQA accreditation is different than that for URAC. And URAC takes a harder approach. So if you have both, take the harder approach. Usually after 8 files, you can be done with NCQA review. The number of random pulls is very different. So please choose URACs if you're doing both. The other stumbling block credentialing section is that a lot of folks feel if they do a review of policies and procedures annually, they're done. But it actually requires a review of something in quality, which I talked about earlier. What you are going to choose as quality can be anything you want, anything that's meaningful, such as, is there an issue with work history? Is there an issue with getting some information you see re-credentialing being lagged? Choose what you want to see, or it could just be something as simple as, how many additions did we have this year? How many terms and how many recreds? But just remember that they're looking for that as well.
Got it. What else are we talking about
I just
today?
want to go back and loop back to how to prepare our delegate versus our vendor. So are we going to put on the table that we're getting ready for URAC to come and do all their review of documentation? Are we separating it out? And I just wanted to reiterate, because it's really the stumbling block, that again, your barometer is a vendor is any vendor who is touching PHI. They are not a delegate. So your the most common ones we see are translation lines, the shredded companies, and what else? Okay.
And offsite document storage. Yeah, very different set of requirements for these entities, and that's why we don't want them on the list as you're preparing for your validation review. You want them on a separate list, and you want a comprehensive list of your vendors that touch PHI. There was a little period in URAC history where URAC called this quasi-delegation, but really it's better to think about this as vendors that touch PHI who are not delegated contractors. So this is handled under both Core 4, and I mean the standard Core 4 under the old standards, and Core 16, or Farm Core 16. And in both cases, you want to submit, and the URAC language I think could use some improvement here in its interpretive guide. First of all, it's not spelled out in the standard. The standard does not say you need to submit a business associate agreement or a vendor agreement. You find all of this only in the, in fact, for a while when this first came out, it wasn't anywhere. You just kind of heard back from URAC on RFI, but they put this requirement into the interpretive guide a few years ago. But the language says or, a business associate agreement or a vendor agreement. And then there are some requirements, and I encourage you to read the interpretive guide. Some requirements like how do you transfer the PHI, what do they do with it, how do you make sure that it's being treated well in accordance with your policies and with the law. But the problem with the or between a business associate agreement and the vendor agreement is that most business associate agreements that I've looked at over the years, and there are probably numbers in a few hundred, are so general for all the business associates that an organization might have. So it's written in general language. It actually doesn't describe what URAC wants to see, which is, does your shredding company come on site and shred there, or do they come on site and take documents to another place and shred there, and what kind of training program do they have for their employees, and so on. That's all housed in the vendor agreement. So for years, we have recommended that you submit both a business associate agreement, unless you're in workers' comp where you don't have to, and a vendor agreement, so that you have both those bases covered. because it's core 4, URAC is actually, it's one of the few areas where URAC actually assesses whether you are obeying the law. And the law, if you're not in workers' comp, says you got to have a business associate agreement with your business associates, and those are includes your vendors that touch PHI. But again, and I'll repeat this because it seems to bear repeating based on our experience, the business associate agreement alone is not sufficient. Pair with each business associate agreement a vendor agreement that describes the process of transfer, storage, destruction of PHI with your vendor that touches PHI.
Okay, so I'm gonna, on that theme, move to, we have a couple of questions, and I'm starting with the last question because it seems relevant. So the first part of it is vendors/subcontractors who handle PHI are business associates per HIPAA. So you want a list of all business associates. As to contract, templates for vendor agreement and business associate agreement, or actual copies, or both. So that's from the same person. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Let me see if could you say that again?
Okay, vendors/subcontractors who handle PHI are business associates per HIPAA. So you want a list of all business associates. Okay, and
yeah.
And then the follow-up to that is, as to contracts, templates for vendor agreement and business associate agreement, or actual copies, or both.
Yeah, so there's 2 stages, as you all know, in the URAC process. The first stage is the desktop review process. And for desktop review, URAC accepts either a template agreement or a sample agreement. And I would say of each. Some reviewers aren't quite so picky at the desktop review level, but increasingly more are. And so I would encourage you to have a template BAA, and most of you have a template BAA because you've had to do that across all of your vendors. And then a sample, and you can white out anything that's specific to that particular vendor. URAC doesn't want to know about pricing or other terms of the contract like that, but they do want to see, and they list right in the interpretive guide what you want to see, so don't white out any of that stuff. And basically, how does the PHI get transferred to your shredding company? Do they come on site? Do they shred on site? All of that. So one of each at the desktop review phase. Now, fast forward to the validation review, whether it's on site or the virtual version that is increasingly done by URAC. You're going to need to have both of those contracts for all of your vendors, just in case because they'll do a random draw and they might pull. You don't want them to pull someone that doesn't have a BAA or a vendor agreement that meets those requirements.
Okay. The next question is, can you please provide a few examples of how specialty pharmacies use delegated functions besides a call center?
Almost never. Almost all of our specialty pharmacy clients sign an attestation on the desktop review phase that says we do not delegate any functions under the URAC definition of delegation. It's very, very rare.
So here's one from earlier in the world. If notification is not within the scope of contract for a organization, are the notifications delegated work back to the TPA health plan, or, sorry, you lost me. Did the question cut out?
No, we heard you.
Okay.
We just didn't see you for a couple of seconds.
Is it correct to state that the notification criteria, which is really standards HUM 2224, is inapplicable to the organization since they do not have the responsibility to provide notices per contract?
This is almost a paleo question. I remember discussing this with Lori Harris Stevens and you back in, when was that? At least 18 years ago. There's no such thing as upstream delegation, is what we decided then. It's a little less true now. But so the answer to the question is it is a function that never went to the delegated to the entity. So if you're a utilization management organization that is only doing a portion of the roughly 40 standards, let's say, here's a good example. Let's see, notification is a good example. the health plan or TPA is doing the notifications. We've had a client or two over the years that didn't do appeals, and the payer held on to the appeals process. So that whole back end of the HUM standards or WCUM standards never got to the UM organization. So it's actually not accurate to say that the UM organization delegated those functions up to the payer. Rather, it's that they never had them to begin with. So they're out of scope.
Okay. So that is our last question for today. We are at 4:51. Maybe it's time to talk about our call for action, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Well, gosh, what I'd recommend that you do is, if you have any particular follow-up questions, you can reach out to me. I'll be glad to. Lesley and I kind of flipped a coin this morning, and it was me. So reach out to me, and you can schedule a conversation with me, half-hour conversation, and we'll talk. I'll be happy to talk through any particular delegation issues that you have. Are we able to put it up on the screen? The link to that, or
up on the screen? Yes.
Okay. Good. So yeah, please take the opportunity to bring your particular delegation issue to me. We can at no charge. I'll be happy. I love talking about delegation, so I'll be happy to chat with you about delegation.
Tom, since you are leading this technologically, apparently I'm being told that you need to trigger the CTA, and then it'll go up on the screen. So it says,
oh, this is
and I
dead.
apologize, you guys. It says one of you needs to click call to action and then click show.
Let me see here. Because, oh, there we go. Call to action. Sadly, I didn't bring my good reading glasses today. There we go. So I hit save. No, that doesn't do it. I'm not doing it right. Maybe I'll just copy the URL.
Okay, it actually
put it
says
in the chat
just
box.
Hit show.
There. Oh, I don't see show. There we go.
Perfect.
There is the call to action. Got it. Part of our technical difficulties was my walking out of the house without non-sunglasses reading that.
Well, we thank everybody for joining us today, and we invite you to contact us. We will have a new webinar coming soon, which we'll announce. Also, take a look at our nugget that went out for our it was on delegation this week as well. It goes into the definition if you wanted to share that with other folks in your organization who couldn't join the call. This call will indeed be available for recording, so you can join back in and come online from that invitational email, and soon you'll get notice about the recording. It's been asked whether or not we can provide a transcript. We haven't done that so far. If you have an interest in it, please do contact us. We can make an arrangement for such a thing. But I believe that the video will allow you also to hear and see the questions that were shared today. Okay, so we thank you for your time. Tom, do you have any exit that you would like to share?
I don't. I'm just delighted to be here with you all. I encourage you to keep your eye out for information about next month's webinar. And we're going to try to do this every month as long as you're interested. So please join us again. Thanks so much for your time and attention.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.